At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand, lighting the room like a warning I couldn't ignore. I stared at the screen for a second, half hoping it would stop on its own. It didn't. My father's name kept glowing back at me, steady and insistent. I answered, already sitting up. His voice was tight, urgent, clipped in a way I recognized from years ago. "Sophie has a trip tomorrow," he said. "You need to transfer $7,500 to me immediately." I waited for the explanation that never came. Instead, I heard whispers. Not panic. Not fear. Quiet, hurried murmurs layered beneath his words. My stepmother. My sister. Planning, not reacting. My father kept talking, repeating the amount, repeating the word urgent, as if speed could replace clarity. He never once explained why the money had to come from me. He never once asked if I could afford it. When I asked a single question, he talked around it. That was the moment something settled in my chest. This wasn't about a trip, and it definitely wasn't about Sophie. So I said one word. No. I hung up, placed my phone face down, and lay back in the dark. I didn't know yet that by morning the police would call, and I had no idea that one late-night demand would expose everything my family had been quietly working toward for years. My name is Emily Carter. I was 30 years old at the time, living alone in a small but carefully earned apartment, the kind of place you build when you've learned not to rely on anyone else to rescue you. I paid my bills on time. I planned ahead. I didn't borrow money, and I didn't lend it to family anymore, not after learning how easily help can turn into expectation. My relationship with my father had become polite distance. We spoke on birthdays, holidays, the occasional check-in that carried more obligation than warmth. He remarried years after my mother died, and with that marriage came a new household rhythm I was never quite part of. My stepmother ran that house. Sophie, their daughter, together was its center. I was the capable one, the one who had things handled, the one who didn't need support because I had learned to stand on my own. That label had followed me for years, quiet but heavy, and it always seemed to surface right before someone needed something. Still, a call at 2 a.m. is different. It strips away pretense. After I hung up, I lay there listening to the hum of the building, the distant traffic, the quiet that follows a decision you can't take back. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel cruel. I felt alert the way you do when your instincts finally speak louder than your habits. I thought about my mother then, not in a dramatic way, just as a presence I'd learned to carry with me. She had been careful, thoughtful, protective in ways that didn't always make sense until later. She believed in preparation and systems that worked even when people didn't. She used to say that clarity was kindness, even when it made others uncomfortable. I went back to sleep. In the morning, sunlight filled the room like nothing had happened. I showered, made coffee, checked my emails. No missed calls, no follow-up messages. That silence should have felt like relief, but it didn't. It felt like the pause before something else moved. I replayed the call while brushing my teeth. The exact number. The rehearsed urgency, the way my father spoke as if the decision had already been made, and my role was simply to comply. The whispers in the background timing his words. I realized I hadn't been asked. I'd been instructed. And I realized something else. If this were truly an emergency, if something had actually gone wrong, they wouldn't have accepted no. They would have pushed harder. The fact that they didn't told me more than the call itself. That day, I went about my routine with a new awareness. I didn't reach out. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't defend my choice. I had learned the hard way that explanations are often treated like invitations to argue. Silence, on the other hand, forces people to reveal their next move. If you've ever felt that quiet shift in your stomach when something doesn't add up, you know the feeling I'm talking about. The moment when a familiar voice suddenly sounds rehearsed, when urgency feels staged, when love starts to sound like leverage. That was where I stood, not knowing yet how far this would go, only knowing that saying no had changed the rules. And if you're listening to this because you've lived through family pressure, late-night demands, or that uneasy sense that something hidden is about to surface, stay with me. What happened next was nothing like I expected. Make sure you're following the story, and if you want to hear how this unfolded from the inside, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. I woke up to a quiet morning that felt too calm for what had happened just hours earlier. The light through my window was soft, ordinary, the kind that usually settles me. That morning it didn't. My phone lay untouched on the nightstand where I'd left it after the call screened dark. No missed messages, no follow-ups. That silence felt deliberate. I made coffee and stood by the counter, replaying my father's voice in my head. The exact amount, the urgency without explanation, the way he hadn't asked, only told. I checked the time again, half expecting to see a late-night text I'd somehow missed. Nothing. It was as if the moment had never happened. By mid-morning, the calm broke. An unfamiliar number lit up my phone. I hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Carter," a man asked. His tone was professional, measured. "This is Officer Reynolds. I'm calling regarding a financial inquiry connected to your name." My stomach tightened, but I didn't interrupt. I had learned that listening carefully often mattered more than speaking quickly. He confirmed my identity, then continued. "We're following up on a report made early this morning involving an attempted transfer connected to an account where you're listed as the beneficiary." The word beneficiary landed heavier than I expected. I leaned against the counter, my coffee cooling untouched. "What kind of transfer?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "There was an attempt flagged by the institution," he said. "The timing raised concerns, and we're verifying authorization." I thought of the call at 2 a.m., the way my father had repeated the amount like it was a script, the way the whispers stopped when I spoke. Officer Reynolds paused, then asked a simple question. "Did you authorize a transfer of $7,500 last night?" "No," I said. The word came easily this time. There was silence on the other end, not awkward, just intentional. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. More careful, more alert. "Thank you for clarifying," he said. "That helps." He explained that the attempt had been routed through a channel that didn't match my usual activity. It hadn't gone through, but it had triggered a review. The report had been filed because the request referenced family authority and urgency without proper verification. Family authority. I stared out the window, watching a woman walk her dog across the street, life moving on as if nothing had changed. "Who made the request?" I asked. "At this stage I can't share names," he said. "But I can confirm it was not you, and it was not an institution acting on your behalf." The words settled slowly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't someone asking questions. This was action. Officer Reynolds asked a few more clarifying questions, whether I'd shared access recently, whether anyone else had permission to speak for me. I answered honestly. No, no, no. Each answer felt like a small step away from the life I thought I understood. "There have been prior inquiries connected to this account," he added almost as an aside. "Not transfers, requests, nothing that went through." "How many?" I asked. "A few," he said. "Over the last several months." I closed my eyes. The trip, the urgency, the exact number. None of it had been spontaneous. It had been tested, probed, refined. Officer Reynolds advised me not to confront anyone yet. He suggested I secure my documents, review my account activity, and expect follow-up contact as the review continued. Before hanging up, he used a phrase that stayed with me long after the call ended. "This may involve family exploitation." When the line went dead, the apartment felt different. Smaller. Quieter. As if the walls were listening. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop, pulling up records I hadn't looked at in years. Notifications I'd dismissed as routine. Emails I'd archived without much thought. Patterns began to form where I hadn't seen any before. Small requests, vague language, always framed as temporary, always tied to someone else's need. I thought of my mother then more clearly than I had the night before. The way she'd explained things when I was younger, not dramatically, just firmly. She believed in preparation, in boundaries that didn't need defending because they were already in place. She had taught me that kindness didn't mean access and love didn't require surrender. I realized sitting there with the morning light fading that saying no hadn't stopped anything. It had revealed it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my father. Just one line. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. I replayed the call in my head again, this time with new ears, the rehearsed urgency, the exact amount, the way my father had spoken as if the decision was already made. The whispers timing his pauses. I saw it now for what it was, a test. A measure of how easily I could be moved. If I'd said yes, they would have tried again. And again. $7,500 was never the goal. It was the door. I thought about how close I'd come to opening it without realizing what was on the other side. That afternoon, I gathered paperwork into neat stacks, not because I needed them immediately, but because order gave me clarity. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own, and pretending it was a misunderstanding wouldn't protect me. By evening, the quiet had returned heavier, now weighted with meaning. I understood something then that I hadn't the night before. Saying no wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment everything began to surface. The officer's words stayed with me long after the call ended. Beneficiary of record. Prior inquiries. Family exploitation. They echoed in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table staring at a stack of papers I hadn't touched in years. I hadn't needed to. The trust had done exactly what it was meant to do, exist quietly in the background, untouched, unquestioned. Until now. I pulled the old folder from the back of my filing cabinet, the one labeled in my mother's handwriting. Her letters were neat, deliberate, the way she did everything. Inside were copies of documents, notes she'd left for me, and a short letter she'd written shortly before she died. I'd read it once, then again a year later, and then I'd tucked it away because it hurt less not to look at it too often. That morning I read it slowly. She had explained the trust in plain language, not as a financial instrument, but as a safeguard. She wrote about change, how people behave differently when circumstances shift, when new relationships form, when fear or entitlement creeps in. She didn't accuse anyone by name. She didn't have to. I remembered the day she first brought it up. We were sitting at the small table in the kitchen, sunlight catching the dust in the air. My father was at work. There was no urgency in her voice, just intention. She told me she wanted to make sure I'd always have something that couldn't be negotiated away from me, something that didn't require permission. "This isn't for emergencies other people create," she'd said, meeting my eyes. "This is for your future, and sometimes the best protection is distance." At the time, I thought she was being cautious. I didn't understand how much foresight it took to build something meant to stand between you and the people who believe they deserve what you have. The trust had rules, clear ones, written authorization, verified purpose, independent review. It wasn't designed to be flexible. It was designed to be firm. Any request that didn't meet those conditions would be flagged automatically, which meant what had happened the night before wasn't an accident. I began connecting timelines. My mother passed away. My father remarried not long after. Household finances shifted. Decisions were made without discussion. I stayed polite, distant, grateful for the space. Somewhere along the way, my silence must have been mistaken for absence. I thought about my stepmother, the way she organized everything with an air of competence, the way she spoke for the family even when no one asked her to. I thought about Sophie, always framed as the reason something needed to happen now urgently without delay. Her needs were never questioned. They were simply presented. The trip, the timing, the urgency. It all fit too neatly. I logged into the trust portal and reviewed the activity history. There it was. Small inquiries, requests for information, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have alarmed me on its own. Each one framed as a question, each one denied quietly by the system. They hadn't taken anything because they couldn't. Not yet. What unsettled me wasn't the audacity of the attempt. It was the confidence behind it. Confidence comes from repetition, from believing that if you push often enough, something will eventually give. I thought about my father then, and the knot in my chest tightened. He wasn't foolish. He wasn't helpless. But he had always preferred peace over confrontation, even if that peace came at someone else's expense. I couldn't tell yet whether he understood the full weight of what was being attempted or whether he'd convinced himself it was harmless because it hadn't succeeded. That uncertainty lingered, uncomfortable but necessary. One line from my mother's letter stood out as I reread it. People don't steal what they don't feel entitled to. They justify it first. I closed my eyes, letting the truth of it settle. No one had asked for permission. They had asked for compliance. I knew then that confronting anyone would be a mistake. Emotion would muddy the facts. Explanations would be twisted into openings. If this was going to end, it would end with clarity, not argument. I gathered the documents and secured them in a new folder, digital and physical. I changed passwords, enabled additional alerts. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that attention invites escalation. As I worked, a notification popped up on my screen, one I recognized but hadn't thought much of before. A routine alert dismissed months ago. I opened it this time, reading it with new eyes. It referenced a request made on my behalf that I'd never authorized, flagged, and denied. The date matched a weekend visit I'd made to my father's house, a visit where I'd left my laptop unattended on the dining room table. The realization was quiet and sharp. This hadn't been a single attempt. It had been a series, a strategy. Each denial treated not as a stop, but as feedback. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly. The trust hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as my mother intended. The danger wasn't in what had been taken. It was in what had been tried. By the time evening came, I felt different. Not angry, not afraid, certain. Whatever came next would come because someone else chose to push again. And now I would be ready when they did. I didn't call my father. I didn't text my stepmother. Every instinct told me to ask why, to demand explanations, to force honesty out into the open. I ignored that instinct. The officer's advice echoed in my head, don't alert anyone yet. Clarity comes from records, not arguments. I opened my calendar and found the contact information for the trust administrator. It had been years since I'd spoken to anyone there. The trust had existed quietly, doing its job without requiring my attention. I sent a brief email, formal and neutral, requesting a routine review of recent activity. No accusations, no emotion, just facts. The reply came faster than I expected. The administrator introduced herself by name and asked if we could speak by phone. Her tone, even through text, was careful. When she called, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. Yes, she said after confirming my identity. There was an attempted request associated with your trust. It was flagged automatically. I waited, letting the silence do its work. And no, she continued, this wasn't an isolated inquiry. I closed my eyes. She walked me through the timeline, slowly, methodically. Over the past several months, there had been multiple inquiries. Not transfers, not withdrawals, requests for access, requests for exceptions. Each framed differently. Each denied quietly by the system. At first, the amounts mentioned were small. Test numbers. Sums that could be explained away as mistakes or misunderstandings. Then the language changed. Urgency appeared. Family need. Temporary solutions. Always the same promise approval would come later. It never did. What concerned us, she said, was the pattern. The requests didn't come from me. They didn't follow proper authorization channels. Someone had repeatedly attempted to speak on my behalf, claiming I was unavailable or unreachable. In more than one instance, they suggested implied consent. Implied consent. I asked who had made those claims. She didn't name names, but she didn't have to. She mentioned a familiar email address, a voice recorded on calls that matched earlier interactions, a tone of confidence that assumed cooperation would eventually replace compliance. They weren't desperate, she said carefully. They were persistent. That distinction mattered. The administrator explained that persistence, especially paired with misrepresentation, triggers internal safeguards. Each denied request strengthened the system's response. Each attempt left a record. What began as inquiries had crossed into something else. This is now documented as attempted unauthorized access, she said, which means additional protocols apply. I felt something shift inside me then. Not relief, not vindication, understanding. I asked if there had been any successful withdrawals. She said no. The trust had held. The barriers my mother insisted on had done exactly what they were built to do. But barriers only matter if someone is trying to get through them. I thought about the 2 a.m. call, the urgency, the exact number, the timing. It wasn't random. It was escalation. A larger test after smaller ones failed. The administrator told me that under policy, repeated misrepresentation could require mandatory reporting to compliance authorities. Not yet, she clarified. But close. Very close. What would you like us to do next? She asked. The question sat between us, heavy with implication. I could freeze everything, shut it all down, cut off every line of inquiry immediately. It would be justified. Clean. But clean endings don't always tell the full truth. Not yet, I said. I want to understand their next move. There was a pause, then a soft acknowledgement. We'll continue monitoring closely, she said, and we'll notify you immediately if there's further activity. After the call ended, I sat still, letting the information settle. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a sustained effort, a plan that adapted when it failed. Confidence like that doesn't come from nowhere. I thought of my stepmother again, the way she handled logistics, the way she spoke with certainty about what was reasonable. I thought of my father's silence after the call, the way he hadn't followed up, hadn't explained, hadn't apologized. Silence can be an answer when you know how to listen. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from Sophie this time. Casual, almost cheerful, asking if I was coming by this weekend. I stared at the screen, the timing too neat to ignore. When money didn't work, proximity often followed. I didn't reply. That evening, another notification arrived from the trust system. An alert, brief and factual. Another inquiry had been made. Not a request this time. A question about eligibility criteria, framed as general information. They were adjusting. I forwarded the alert to the administrator without comment. She replied minutes later. Received. I understood then that I didn't need to do anything else. Every move they made from this point forward would speak for itself. The trust wasn't asleep. It was watching. And now so was I. I placed my phone face down and looked around my apartment at the quiet order I'd built for myself. This wasn't about protecting money anymore. It was about protecting boundaries that had been tested too many times to count. They thought persistence would wear me down. They were wrong. This wasn't the first time they'd tried, and it wouldn't be the last. But it would be the last time they tried without consequences. The silence didn't last. For a few days after my conversation with the trust administrator, my phone stayed quiet. No late-night calls. No urgent messages. No sudden concern for my well-being. It was as if the family line had gone dead, and I knew better than to believe that meant acceptance. Silence like that usually meant a strategy was being rewritten. The first call came in the middle of a weekday afternoon. It was my father. His voice sounded different this time. Slower. Careful. The urgency was gone, replaced by something wounded, almost theatrical. "I don't understand why you wouldn't help us," he said. "We're family, Emily." I leaned back in my chair and let him talk. He spoke about stress, about responsibility, about how Sophie was under pressure and how I had always been the strong one. He didn't mention the amount. He didn't mention the trust. He talked instead about loyalty, about how disappointed he was that I'd hung up on him. I asked one question. What exactly do you need the money for? There was a pause. Then he repeated himself, only softer this time. Family, support, doing the right thing. He still didn't answer. That was confirmation enough. A few minutes after we hung up, a message came through from my stepmother. Longer, sharper, written with the kind of false concern that's meant to sting. She told me I'd misunderstood everything, that no one was trying to take anything from me, that my reaction had been extreme. She reminded me of how much she'd done for this family, how hard things had been, how unfair it was that I'd made things difficult by saying no. Then she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Your mother wouldn't have wanted this, she wrote. I stared at the screen, my hands steady, my pulse not. My mother's name was not an accident. It was a tool. She was being used to shame me into compliance to soften a boundary that had already held firm. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message arrived, this time from Sophie. Her tone was different from both of them. Less polished, more entitled. I don't get why you're acting like this, she wrote. It's not like the money is doing anything just sitting there. Dad said you have more than enough. There it was. Not need. Expectation. She talked about the trip finally giving details she hadn't mentioned before. It wasn't sudden. It had been planned for weeks. Deposits had already been paid. The urgency wasn't about necessity. It was about timing, about locking something in before anyone could say no. I read the message twice, then once more slower. Each sentence revealed more than she intended. The trip wasn't a crisis. It was leverage. I didn't reply to her either. That evening, my stepmother called again. This time she didn't bother with warmth. Her voice was clipped, irritated, layered with accusation. She said I was tearing the family apart, that my refusal had embarrassed them, that people were starting to ask questions about what she didn't say. She hinted at consequences without naming them, suggested that I was being selfish, suggested that maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, that maybe I needed time to calm down before making decisions that affected everyone. Fear had replaced guilt. I listened, saying nothing until she ran out of words. When she finally paused, expecting a response, I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. I knew then that the shift had happened. Money hadn't worked, politeness hadn't worked, family hadn't worked. So they moved on to pressure. Over the next 2 days, the messages piled up. Different tones, same theme. I was unreasonable. I was cold. I was selfish. Each message was carefully framed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like the problem in a situation I hadn't created. I documented everything. I saved screenshots, logged timestamps, not because I planned to use them yet, but because clarity lives in details. Patterns are easier to see when you don't rely on memory alone. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty, it was the certainty. They spoke as if access to my life, my resources, my decisions was a given, as if my refusal was a temporary malfunction that could be corrected with enough pressure. They were wrong. Late one night, my stepmother sent one final message. It was shorter than the others, more dangerous because of it. She mentioned lawyers, said she hoped it wouldn't come to that, said she didn't want to see things get ugly. Threats don't need to be loud to be effective. They just need to be understood. I forwarded the message to my attorney without comment. His reply came quickly. One sentence. This helps. That was when I realized how completely the dynamic had changed. Every attempt to control me was becoming evidence. Every word they chose out of anger or entitlement tightened the net they didn't even know they were standing in. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. I went to bed that night thinking about how often strength is mistaken for availability, how being capable becomes an invitation for others to lean too hard. I had spent years being the easy one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't make waves. Saying no hadn't made me cruel, it had made me visible. And visibility, I was learning, terrified people who had grown comfortable taking without asking. They thought guilt would bring me back in line. All it did was show me exactly how far they were willing to go. The police call came the next morning just after 9. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee untouched on the counter, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. Something in my chest tightened before I answered the way it does when a storm arrives without warning. "Is this Emily Carter?" the voice asked. "Yes. This is Officer Daniel Reeves with the County Police Department. I need to ask you a few questions regarding a report filed last night involving your father." The room felt suddenly smaller. I sat down slowly, my back against the counter, and told him I was listening. He explained that a call had been placed from my father's residence at 2:18 a.m., a report of suspected financial fraud. According to the caller, a large sum of money had been withheld by a family member, and there was concern about unauthorized control over a trust account. I didn't interrupt him. The words landed exactly where I expected them to. The officer continued, his tone professional but cautious. He said my name had come up in connection with the account. He asked if I was aware of any recent financial disputes within my family. "Yes," I said. One word: clean, accurate. I told him about the 2 a.m. call, about the demand, about the whispers in the background, about my refusal. I told him I was the sole beneficiary of a trust established by my late mother and that no one else had legal access to it. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to picture him writing something down. "Do you have documentation of the trust?" he asked. "Yes." "Have you authorized anyone else to manage or withdraw funds?" "No." Another pause. He told me that after reviewing the initial report, several inconsistencies had come up. The trust account my father referenced didn't match any account linked to his name. The amounts he claimed were misused didn't align with any transaction history. And most importantly, the caller had attempted to frame the situation as elder exploitation despite being unable to demonstrate any legal authority over the funds. I closed my eyes. They hadn't just asked for money. They had tried to flip the narrative. Officer Reeves said the call raised red flags: false reporting, misrepresentation, potential attempted fraud. He asked if I'd be willing to provide a statement to clarify ownership of the trust and confirm that no funds had been accessed improperly. "Yes," I said again, this time without hesitation. He scheduled a brief in-person meeting for later that afternoon. Routine, he assured me. Just to close the loop. When the call ended, I didn't move for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the morning looked normal. Neighbors walking dogs, cars passing, life continuing as if my family hadn't just tried to weaponize the police against me. I thought about the moment my father realized intimidation might work better than guilt. About the decision my stepmother must have made in the dark, choosing escalation over retreat. About Sophie likely asleep, unaware that her trip had just detonated something far larger than a plane ticket. By noon, I had assembled everything. Trust documents, correspondence, screenshots, a timeline of calls and messages. I didn't bring emotion with me. I brought facts. The station was quiet when I arrived. Officer Reeves met me in a small interview room with neutral walls and a metal table. He was younger than I expected, calm, observant. He didn't rush me. I explained the history, my mother's death, the trust, the boundary I'd set, the sudden demand, the coordinated pressure, the shift from persuasion to threat. When I mentioned the false report, his jaw tightened slightly. Not judgment, recognition. "This isn't uncommon," he said carefully, "but it is serious." He explained that filing a report under false pretenses, especially to gain access to someone else's finances, could carry consequences. He said they were still determining intent, but that my documentation helped establish a clear pattern. He asked if I felt unsafe. "No," I said, then paused. "Not physically." He nodded. That answer told him enough. Before I left, he advised me to limit contact with my family and to document anything further. If they reached out again, especially in ways that suggested coercion or misrepresentation, I was to notify him directly. Walking back to my car, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not fear. Relief. The illusion that I was alone in this had cracked. Their version of events had collided with reality, and reality hadn't sided with them. That evening, my father called again. I didn't answer. A voicemail followed. His voice was tight-controlled, stripped of its earlier righteousness. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that things had gotten out of hand, that involving the police hadn't been his idea. Of course it hadn't. My stepmother sent a message shortly after, apologetic on the surface, frantic underneath. She said they didn't realize how serious things would become, that they only wanted to talk, that family shouldn't handle things this way. I read it once and archived it. They were backpedaling now, scrambling to contain damage they hadn't anticipated. The threat of authority had failed. Worse, it had exposed them. Later that night, a new message came through. Not from my father, not from my stepmother, from Sophie. It was longer than anything she'd sent before, less defensive, more confused. She said Dad was upset, that Mom was stressed, that no one meant for things to blow up. She asked why I couldn't just let this go. I stared at the screen, thinking about how carefully ignorance can be maintained when the truth is inconvenient. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I sent one sentence. This didn't blow up. It was uncovered. I put the phone down and didn't check it again. That night, for the first time since the call at 2 a.m., I slept without replaying conversations in my head. The anxiety that had hovered at the edge of everything loosened its grip. They had tried to turn me into the villain. They had tried to turn the system against me. Instead, they had handed me clarity. And clarity, I was learning, was more powerful than any amount of money they thought they were entitled to take. The letter arrived 3 days later, tucked between a grocery flyer and a utility bill, the envelope thicker than it needed to be. I knew who it was from before I opened it. My father's handwriting hadn't changed. Careful, upright. The kind of script meant to look reasonable even when it wasn't. Inside was a formal notice printed on cream paper, the kind meant to intimidate by aesthetics alone. It claimed that my actions had raised concerns about my judgment and my ability to manage financial assets responsibly. It referenced family interest, future stability, and the phrase that made my stomach go cold. Temporary conservatorship. They weren't asking anymore. They were laying groundwork. I sat at my dining table, the letter spread out in front of me, and felt something inside me go very still. This wasn't panic. It was recognition. I'd seen this tactic before, just never aimed at me. Frame the target as unstable, cast concern as care, turn resistance into evidence. They wanted control, and they were willing to erase me to get it. The letter cited a law firm I didn't recognize. It claimed they were acting in good faith on behalf of my father and stepmother, citing recent erratic behavior on my part. The refusal to assist financially. The alleged withholding of shared family resources. The concern that I was isolating myself. I laughed once, out loud. A sharp sound that startled me. I hadn't isolated myself. I'd enforced a boundary. That evening, I called the attorney whose name Officer Reeves had given me. Her assistant transferred me immediately after I explained why I was calling. By the next morning, I was sitting across from her in a quiet office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Her name was Margaret Hale. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out. The trust, the calls, the police report, the letter. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. "They're attempting leverage," she said calmly. "And they're doing it sloppily." She explained that a conservatorship petition required evidence, medical, psychological, financial mismanagement, not a single refusal to fund a vacation, not a healthy adult enforcing a legal boundary. "What they're doing," she said, tapping the letter, "is posturing. They want you scared enough to comply before this ever sees a courtroom." I asked her what would happen if they filed anyway. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. Then they'd have to explain why a trust established by your mother names you as sole beneficiary, why no funds were misused, why a police report contradicts their claims, and why their attempt to access money they don't own escalated into false allegations. She paused, and they'd have to do it under oath. For the first time since this started, I felt the ground shift back under my feet. Margaret advised me not to respond to the letter directly. No emotional rebuttal. No explanations. Silence, she said, was often more unsettling than resistance. She would draft a formal response on my behalf if needed, but for now we would wait. They're counting on you reacting, she said. Let them count wrong. That night my stepmother showed up at my door. I didn't hear her knock at first. I heard her voice through the wood. Tight. Urgent. Using my name the way she did when she wanted something. I stood on the other side of the door and didn't open it. She said they were worried, that Dad hadn't slept, that Sophie was confused, that involving lawyers was unnecessary. I told her through the door that she needed to leave. Her voice sharpened. She said I was being dramatic, that I was overreacting, that families handled things privately. Families don't threaten conservatorship over money they don't own, I said. There was a long silence. Then she said something I will never forget. Your mother would have wanted you to help. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but my voice stayed level. My mother structured that trust so you couldn't touch it. The silence broke into anger. She accused me of being cold, ungrateful, of thinking I was better than them because I had resources. She said Sophie needed opportunities, that it wasn't fair one daughter had everything while the other struggled. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain that the trust wasn't everything, that it was security, not excess, that my mother had built it brick by brick with intention. Instead, I said, "You need to leave." She left eventually, muttering about court and consequences and how this wasn't over. She was right about one thing. It wasn't. The next morning, Sophie called. Her voice was different this time. Not defensive, not demanding, fractured. She asked me why lawyers were involved. She said Mom was crying. Dad was furious. She said she never meant for things to get this serious. I told her the truth. Carefully, not cruelly. I explained that the money wasn't communal, that it wasn't up for debate, that when I said no, the response wasn't acceptance but escalation, that involving the police and threatening conservatorship wasn't a misunderstanding. She went quiet. Then she asked, "Did they really try to say you weren't stable?" "Yes," I said. Another pause. "I didn't know," she whispered. I believed her, at least in that moment. Sophie had always been shielded from consequences, fed just enough narrative to stay comfortable. I told her I loved her, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, that I was protecting what my mother had left me. She didn't argue. When the call ended, I sat with the quiet and let it settle. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. What started as a demand had become a campaign. What they thought was leverage had turned into exposure. Every step they took to control me documented their intent more clearly. They were building a case against me without realizing they were building one against themselves. And I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a trip. It never was. It was about entitlement, about rewriting history, about deciding that my inheritance was negotiable because my boundaries made them uncomfortable. They wanted me scared. Instead, they had made me prepared. And preparation, I was learning, was its own kind of power. The first real proof didn't come from my family. It came from a bank statement. Margaret had warned me this might happen. When people feel control slipping, they get sloppy. They move faster. They make mistakes. And mistakes leave trails. 2 days after my stepmother's visit, my phone lit up with a fraud alert from the trust's financial institution. A routine notification, automated neutral. It flagged a failed attempt to access account information from an unrecognized device. The location wasn't my city. It wasn't even my state. I forwarded the alert to Margaret and drove straight to the bank. The branch manager met me in a glass office with the kind of polite concern reserved for situations that weren't supposed to exist. She pulled up the access logs, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. When she turned the screen toward me, my chest tightened. 3 attempts. Same IP address. Same device fingerprint. All from my father's home address. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The manager explained that while no funds had been moved, someone had attempted to retrieve detailed trust statements, beneficiary structures, and withdrawal procedures. Information you'd only need if you were planning something, or already doing it. She asked if anyone else had authorization. No, I said, and they never will. She nodded and immediately escalated the account's security level. Additional authentication. Manual approval required for any changes. A note placed directly on the trust file. I left with printed records in a sealed envelope. By the time I got back to my car, my hands were shaking. Not with fear, with fury. They hadn't just threatened me. They hadn't just tried to intimidate me into handing over money. They had gone behind my back and tried to break in quietly, hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late. That night, Margaret called me herself. This changes the tone, she said. She explained that attempted unauthorized access, especially following false police reports and conservatorship threats, established a pattern. Intent. Escalation. It wasn't just family conflict anymore. It was potential financial exploitation. She asked me a question that stopped me cold. Did your mother ever mention anyone else having access to her accounts before she passed? I thought about it. About the months after the diagnosis. About how my stepmother suddenly offered to help organize paperwork. About how my father insisted everything would be easier if things were centralized. About how my mother had quietly said once, "Some things are meant to stay separate." I told Margaret that. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I'd like to review the trust formation documents more closely," she said. "There may be something in there your family is counting on you not noticing." The next morning, we sat side by side in her office going through pages I hadn't read in years. I'd trusted that everything was set up properly. I hadn't expected to need to defend it. Margaret paused on one clause. A secondary access provision. My mother had included a temporary administrative role, limited in scope, time-bound, meant to assist with medical expenses if I became incapacitated while she was still alive. The role had expired. But someone had attempted to resurrect it. "They're operating on an old assumption," Margaret said, "that you wouldn't know the difference." I felt sick. They weren't improvising. They were working from memory, from conversations. From moments when my mother had been vulnerable and they'd been listening. Margaret drafted a formal notice that afternoon. A cease and desist. Clear, precise, cold. It outlined the unauthorized access attempts, referenced the false report, and warned that any further interference with the trust would result in immediate legal action. She sent it directly to the firm named in the conservatorship letter. Within hours, the firm withdrew representation. They hadn't known the full story. Or they had and didn't want to be part of it once the facts surfaced. My father called that night. I didn't answer. He left a message that sounded nothing like the man who'd demanded money at 2 a.m. His voice was strained, defensive. He said lawyers were overreacting, that this had spiraled unnecessarily, that families made mistakes. He never apologized. My stepmother followed with a message of her own. Longer, more calculated. She said she felt attacked, that my actions were hurting Sophie, that she didn't recognize me anymore. I listened to it once, then deleted it. The next day, Sophie showed up at my apartment. She looked smaller standing there, less sure. Her confidence had always come from the assumption that someone else would handle consequences. She asked if we could talk. We sat on opposite ends of the couch. She told me Mom said I was trying to ruin the family. Dad said I was being manipulated by lawyers. She said she didn't know what to believe. I told her the truth. Not the version softened for comfort. Not the version filtered through loyalty. I showed her the bank alert, the access logs, the legal notice. I told her they'd tried to get into the trust without my knowledge. Her face drained of color. "They said you were just being difficult," she whispered. I looked at her and felt something shift. Not anger. Sadness. "Difficult people don't trigger fraud alerts," I said gently. She started crying then, quietly. Not dramatically. The kind of tears that come when the narrative you've been living inside collapses. She asked me if the money was ever meant for her. I told her the truth. No, that didn't mean she wasn't loved. It didn't mean she didn't matter. It meant my mother had made choices based on her own values, her own history, her own understanding of responsibility. Sophie nodded slowly. "I think they've been using me," she said. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I just said, "You don't have to choose sides, but you do have to see what's happening." When she left, I felt exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. They had underestimated me, assumed silence meant weakness, assumed boundaries were temporary. Instead, they had exposed themselves piece by piece. The trust hadn't just protected my money, it had revealed their intentions. And now that I could see the whole shape of what they were trying to do, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer about stopping them. It was about making sure they could never try this again. The hearing date arrived in my mailbox before my father ever admitted what he'd done. A thin envelope, official seal, family court letterhead. They had filed anyway, not a conservatorship this time. Something quieter. A petition to review the trust based on potential undue influence and concerns regarding original intent. Legal language designed to sound neutral while reopening doors that had already been closed. I sat on the floor of my living room with the papers spread out around me, reading every word twice. They weren't asking to take control directly anymore. They were trying to cast doubt, to muddy the water, to create enough uncertainty that a judge might order oversight delays reviews. Time. They wanted time. Margaret arrived an hour later. She didn't sit down. She read standing up, pen already moving in her hand, marking sections with sharp precision. "This is desperation," she said. "And desperation makes people reckless." She explained that challenging a trust's intent years after its creation required evidence they didn't have. Medical records, proof of coercion, witnesses willing to say my mother didn't understand what she was signing. "They're going to lean on your father's testimony," she said, "and possibly your stepmother's." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. My mother had been meticulous. She'd documented everything. Doctor visits, legal consultations, notes in her own handwriting explaining why she structured things the way she did. She had anticipated resistance. She just hadn't lived long enough to see it play out. Margaret told me we would counter, not just defend. We would submit the access logs, the false police report, the withdrawn law firm, the unauthorized attempts. We would establish a pattern of coercion and escalation. "They're accusing you of undue influence," she said. "We're going to show undue entitlement." The night before the hearing, my father texted me for the first time since the cease and desist. He said this had gone too far, that he never wanted things in front of a judge, that he was embarrassed, that people were asking questions. I didn't reply. The morning of the hearing, I wore something neutral, nothing sharp, nothing defiant. Margaret had advised calm credibility over visible strength. Judges read posture the way predators read fear. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled, quiet, intimate in a way that made lies echo louder. My father sat on one side with my stepmother. Sophie wasn't there. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not fragile, but diminished. My stepmother sat rigidly upright, hands folded, expression carefully composed. When the judge entered, everything shifted. Margaret spoke first. Clear, efficient. She laid out the trust's origin. My mother's intent. The timeline of events leading up to the petition. The attempted access. The false report. The pressure campaign. She submitted exhibits without drama. Then it was their turn. My father testified that he'd been concerned, that I'd become distant, that my refusal to help Sophie financially had alarmed him, that my mother would have wanted the family supported. The judge asked him if he'd ever been granted access to the trust. No, he admitted. If he'd been named a beneficiary. No, if he'd been aware that the administrative provision had expired years earlier. He hesitated. My stepmother testified next. She spoke about fairness, about opportunity, about how painful it was to watch one daughter thrive while another struggled. Margaret asked one question that cut through everything. Did you attempt to access the trust account from your home address on 3 separate occasions last week? My stepmother froze. She said she didn't remember. Margaret slid the bank records across the table. The judge looked down at them, then back up. The silence stretched. When the hearing ended, the judge didn't deliberate long. She denied the petition in full. No review, no oversight, no further inquiry into the trust's validity. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She addressed my father directly. She said that repeated attempts to interfere with a legally protected trust, combined with false reporting and misrepresentation, bordered on abuse. That if further actions were taken, the court would not look kindly on them. She warned them to cease contact regarding the trust immediately. Outside the courtroom, my father didn't look at me. My stepmother did. There was no anger left in her face, only calculation recalibrating. Sophie called me that night. She said the hearing scared her, that she'd heard things she didn't know, that Mom had told her pieces but not everything, that she didn't like how far it had gone. I listened. I told her I wasn't asking her to choose, that I was asking her to see clearly. She said she needed space. I told her I understood. When the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment, the city quiet outside my window. I expected relief, triumph, something like closure. Instead, what I felt was resolve. They had lost legally, but they hadn't learned. Not yet. They had tried to take something that wasn't theirs and had only stopped when authority intervened. That meant they would remember the boundary, not respect it. And boundaries enforced by courts were safer than those enforced by hope. I opened my laptop and began organizing everything into a single file. Calls, messages, letters, bank alerts, court transcripts. Not for now, for later. Because the kind of people who feel entitled don't stop wanting. They stop when wanting costs too much, and I was done paying the price for their expectations. The silence after the hearing didn't bring peace. It brought recalibration. For a few weeks, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no letters dressed up as concern. My father respected the court's warning, at least on the surface. My stepmother went quiet in a way that felt intentional, not reflective. Sophie stopped reaching out entirely. That was how I knew something else was coming. It started with a notification from the trust's accountant. Not an alert this time, a request. Someone had submitted a formal inquiry asking whether the trust could be leveraged as collateral for educational advancement expenses tied to a dependent family member. The language was careful, polished, legal, and completely inappropriate. I forwarded it to Margaret immediately. She called me within minutes. They're testing a new angle, she said. Not access, not control, influence. The inquiry hadn't come from my father directly. It came from a financial advisory group out of state, a firm that specialized in restructuring family assets under the guise of long-term planning. Margaret asked me a question that made my stomach drop. Has your stepmother ever mentioned anyone advising her on finances? Friends? Church contacts? Networking groups? I thought about it, about the dinners she used to host, the way conversations shifted when money came up, the names she'd dropped casually as if proximity implied credibility. Yes, I said. She's always talking about someone who helped a friend restructure things. Margaret exhaled slowly. They're outsourcing pressure now, she said, which means they're either running out of options or preparing for something bigger. That night I did something I should have done earlier. I hired a private investigator. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted dirt, because I wanted context. I wanted to understand how far back this mindset went, and how many times I'd mistaken pattern for coincidence. The investigator's report arrived 10 days later. It was concise, factual, devastating. My stepmother had been involved in 2 prior disputes involving inheritance. Not lawsuits, misunderstandings. Situations where assets had been redirected, reinterpreted, or quietly reassigned through pressure and timing. In one case, a former spouse's family trust had been amended under emergency circumstances shortly before his death. In another, a distant aunt's estate had been contested and settled privately, the details sealed. No convictions, no public records of wrongdoing, just smoke, and smoke only appears where something has burned. The report also noted something else. The advisory group that contacted the trust accountant had worked with her before, multiple times. I sat on my couch reading the report twice, then a third time. This hadn't started with Sophie's trip. That was just the excuse. This was a pattern of proximity and opportunity, of waiting until grief softened defenses, of framing entitlement as necessity and pressure as care. I sent everything to Margaret. "This strengthens our position," she said. "And it explains why they keep shifting strategies. They're used to people folding." The next move came faster than expected. My father called. Not at 2 a.m. this time, early evening. His voice sounded tired. Not angry, not pleading, measured. He said he wanted to talk. Just the 2 of us. No lawyers, no accusations. He said he missed me. I told him I'd meet him in a public place. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. He looked older than he had at the hearing. Not frail, but worn. The confidence he used to carry had thinned. He said he didn't recognize what things had become, that he never intended for it to turn legal, that he felt caught between loyalty and regret. I listened. Then he said something that clarified everything. "You have to understand," he said. "Your stepmother worries about security, about the future. She's always thinking ahead." I nodded. He said Sophie was struggling, that she felt embarrassed, that the trip had been important to her sense of independence. I nodded again. Then he said, "Your mother trusted you. But maybe she didn't see everything." There it was, the quiet undermining, the suggestion that my mother's judgment was incomplete, that her decisions were outdated, that they could be improved upon. I told him something I hadn't said out loud before. My mother saw exactly what she needed to see. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked if there was any version of this where I could help Sophie directly. Not through the trust. Just help. I took a breath. "I'm not punishing Sophie," I said. "I'm refusing to participate in a system where my boundaries are treated as obstacles." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "If you don't help her, she'll remember that." I met his eyes. "So will I," I said. We didn't argue after that. When we parted, I felt lighter. Not because anything was resolved, but because I no longer felt responsible for preserving their version of harmony. 2 days later, Margaret called again. "They've made a mistake," she said. The advisory group had sent a follow-up inquiry, more aggressive, less careful. It included internal language referencing anticipated access and future compliance. It assumed consent that didn't exist. Margaret forwarded it to the court as evidence of continued interference. This time the response was swift, a formal warning, a cease order, and notice that any further attempts to influence or pressure trust administration could result in sanctions. The advisory group backed out immediately. My stepmother didn't call after that, neither did my father. Sophie sent a single message. I didn't know it went this deep. I replied honestly, neither did I, until it did. That night I stood in my apartment surrounded by documents I no longer needed to reference daily. The threat hadn't vanished, but it had been contained. They had lost leverage, lost momentum. What remained was something quieter and harder to face. The understanding that love, when mixed with entitlement, can become something unrecognizable. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to forgive or fight. It's to step out of the pattern entirely. They had spent years assuming I would bend. Now they were learning what it meant when I didn't. The final blow didn't come from a letter or a lawyer. It came from Sophie. She called late on a Sunday afternoon, her voice tight, careful, like she was choosing each word from a script she didn't fully believe in. She asked if we could meet. Just us. No parents. No intermediaries. We met at a small park near the river, the kind of place our mother used to take me when I was younger. I arrived early and sat on a bench watching the water move steadily past, thinking about how much effort it takes to redirect a current once it's set. Sophie arrived 10 minutes late. She looked different, quieter, less certain. She didn't sit right away. She paced, hands shoved into her jacket pockets, then finally dropped onto the bench beside me. She didn't start with an apology. She started with a confession. She told me that months before the 2 a.m. call, our stepmother had asked her to sign something. Nothing dramatic, she'd said. Just paperwork for school. Forms that would make travel easier, accounts easier, life smoother. Sophie admitted she hadn't read it closely. She said she trusted them. The words landed heavier than anything else had so far. She explained that after the court hearing, things at home had shifted. Tension everywhere. Conversations stopping when she entered the room. Her mother snapping at small things. Our father retreating into silence. She said she'd overheard arguments late at night about losing control and how this never would have happened if Emily had just cooperated. Then she said the part that made my chest ache. She said she'd found copies of documents in her mother's desk. Trust-related, drafts, notes, scenarios. Contingency plans labeled with my name. They had planned for me to say no. They had planned for escalation. Sophie said she finally understood that the trip was never the goal. It was leverage, a test. And when it failed, they moved to pressure. When pressure failed, they moved to authority. She looked at me, then really looked and said, "They weren't asking you. They were trying to corner you." I nodded. She told me she'd confronted her mother. That the conversation had ended badly. Accusations, tears, claims of betrayal. Her mother said Sophie was being ungrateful, that she didn't understand how the world worked, that money was security, and security justified hard choices. Sophie said she asked about our mother. Her mother told her to stop living in the past. That was when something broke. Sophie said she'd packed a bag that night and gone to a friend's house. That she didn't know what she was going to do next. That she felt like everything she'd believed about our family had been rearranged without her consent. She asked me if I hated her. I told her no. She asked if I blamed her. I told her the truth. I blamed the people who taught you that love comes with conditions. She cried then. Not quietly, not neatly. She cried the way people do when the ground under them finally gives way and they realize they've been standing on borrowed certainty. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't lecture her either. I let her feel it. When she calmed down, she said she wanted to fix things. Not with money, not with legal strategies, but with honesty. She said she was willing to testify if it ever came to that. Willing to state under oath that she'd been used as a narrative tool. That she hadn't needed the money the way it was framed. That she'd been told the trust was flexible when it wasn't. I told her I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but I thanked her. We sat in silence after that, watching the river. The sun was starting to set, the light shifting from sharp to soft. Sophie asked if I would ever forgive them. I thought about it. About forgiveness that demands amnesia. About peace that only exists if someone else stays small. About the difference between releasing anger and reopening doors. I don't know yet, I said. Forgiveness isn't the same as access. She nodded. Before we parted, she told me she'd decided not to take the trip, that she'd canceled it herself, that it felt wrong to enjoy something built on pressure and manipulation. I didn't praise her. I didn't say she'd done the right thing. I said, "That was your choice." And I meant it. That night, my father left a voicemail. He said Sophie hadn't come home, that my stepmother was beside herself, that he didn't understand why things had to fracture this way. I didn't return the call. Margaret checked in the next morning. She told me that after the advisory firm withdrew and the court issued its warning, no further actions had been taken. No new filings, no inquiries, no attempts at access. The machine had stalled. But machines don't stop unless something inside them breaks. Sophie texted me later that day. She said she was looking for her own place, that she was applying for jobs that didn't involve travel or family connections, that she wanted to build something without strings attached. I told her I was proud of her. I meant that too. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by quiet. The kind that feels earned rather than empty. They had lost control over the trust, over the narrative, over me. But the real shift had happened somewhere else. In the space where silence used to be filled with obligation. In the moment when someone finally saw the pattern and stepped out of it. I realized then that this wasn't about winning. It was about ending the cycle. And cycles only end when someone decides they're done being useful to them. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. Weeks passed without calls, letters, or carefully worded messages pretending to be concern. The trust sat untouched, fortified by legal clarity and something stronger than paperwork finality. My father stopped reaching out. My stepmother disappeared into silence that no longer tried to punish me for not filling it. The machine had stopped grinding because there was nothing left to feed it. Sophie moved into a small apartment across town. Nothing glamorous. A couch borrowed from a friend. A table that wobbled if you leaned too hard. She took a job she found on her own, one that paid less than the life she'd been promised, but more than the one she'd been manipulated into accepting. We met for coffee sometimes. We didn't talk about the trust unless she asked. We didn't talk about our parents unless we had to. What we talked about was quieter. Boundaries. Fear. The strange grief that comes when the people who raised you turn out not to be who you thought they were. One afternoon she told me she was starting therapy. She said she wanted to understand why saying no felt like betrayal, why approval had always felt like oxygen. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to reassure her. I let her claim her own realization. After she left, I walked home alone and realized something else had changed. I wasn't bracing anymore. For weeks, months, I'd lived with a low-level tension humming beneath everything, waiting for the next angle, the next escalation, the next attempt to reframe my autonomy as cruelty. That hum was gone now. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped engaging with the story they wanted me to play a role in. There was no grand apology, no moment where everyone admitted fault and gathered around a table to heal. Life doesn't do that. What it does instead is give you a choice between truth and comfort, and ask which one you're willing to live with. I chose truth. The trust remained exactly what my mother intended it to be. Not a prize, not a bargaining chip, a foundation. Something meant to hold, not to impress. Something built with foresight by a woman who understood that love without boundaries invites erosion. I thought about her often in those quiet weeks. About the way she planned, the way she noticed patterns before others did, the way she loved without surrendering her discernment. She hadn't left me money. She'd left me permission. Permission to say no without apology. Permission to protect what was mine without being labeled selfish. Permission to walk away from dynamics that required my silence to function. One evening, my father sent a final message. Short. Neutral. He said he hoped I was well, that he missed me, that things had gotten out of hand. I stared at it for a long time. Then I archived it. Not out of anger, out of acceptance. Some relationships don't end with slammed doors. They end with quiet distance and the understanding that access is a privilege, not a right. Love doesn't require proximity to manipulation. Family doesn't get to rewrite your boundaries because it finds them inconvenient. I began to build a life that didn't revolve around defending myself. I took up routines that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. Morning walks, evenings without my phone. Work that felt aligned instead of performative. The world didn't collapse because I stopped overextending. It stabilized. And that was the lesson I wish someone had given me sooner. If you're listening to this and you've ever been told that saying no makes you cruel, that protecting your inheritance makes you greedy, that choosing peace over obligation makes you disloyal, let me tell you something clearly. That narrative only benefits the people who profit from your silence. Boundaries are not betrayal. Clarity is not coldness. And walking away from manipulation is not abandonment. It's self-respect. I didn't lose my family. I lost the illusion that love requires sacrifice without consent. And in its place, I gained something steadier, quieter, stronger. My life. On my terms. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through family pressure, inheritance conflict, or the moment when you realized no was the most honest word you had, I'd love to hear from you. Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. And if you want more stories like this, real, layered, and honest about family drama, betrayal, and the strength it takes to reclaim your dignity, stay with us. Subscribe, like, and keep the conversation going. You're not alone here. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't payback. It's choosing yourself and never apologizing for it again.